Great. Thank you, John. Thank you for having us. Thank you all for coming to this virtual conversation. And Tony, thank you for writing this short but important and also updated, I will say, for the paperback edition book. I actually wanted to ask you, we've known each other for a while, but I don't actually know the answer to this question, so I wanted to ask a biographical question. I feel like at any given point in the sort of Russia field in the West, a certain number of people, maybe half or a third, are like me, who were born in Russia and kind of language, and then became interested in Russia, intellectually. But the other kind of more interesting half are people like you who chose Russia as a place to think about and visit and write about. So I thought maybe you could just talk to us about how you became interested in Russia and what your kind of journey has been through times both, exciting and fallow, and then the current moment of total idiocy. So tell us about that.
Thank you, Keith, and thanks for agreeing to take part in this, and thank you also to McNally Jackson for hosting. I know people have a lot of demands on their scarce resources at the moment, but if you can kick some of it the way of independent bookstores, we will all need them in the long run. The biographical question is a good place to start, actually. So I had a remarkable high school Russian teacher, and one of the things she was remarkably good at doing was making connections. So the small English town where I grew up, Exeter, was twinned with a Russian city in the early 90s, thanks to the efforts of my teacher. And it had an exchange with a school as well in Moscow that she organized even before the fall of the Soviet Union. So this was a very active teacher who got us able to physically visit Russia at a time when school kids were not learning much Russian, and certainly they were not able to go and spend time there and live with families. That was very uncommon. So I think, I should also salute my teacher's efforts early on. I think the important aspect of that for me was that my first exposure to Russia came at a point when the country was undergoing these really very dramatic and traumatic changes in the early 90s. I first went in 1993, and then I went again in 1995. I lived there for a year in 97, 98, and then have been back every couple of years ever since then. So my engagement with the country, I would say, has been formed, really shaped by that initial encounter with the confusion, the really strong sense of disorientation that people had, the very, very deep economic crisis, widespread poverty and suffering that I encountered in the 90s. And so my understanding of the Russia of today is that it has to come out of that experience of the 90s. And I think you probably see that in the interpretation I lay out in the book, that it's really, I think you have to understand the 90s in order to understand the Russia of today.
Great. So that does take us to the book. The book has 5 chapters, and each of the chapters has an argument. I want to start with the first 3, which to me are the most provocative and kind of, there are places I feel like I want to ask you questions about. But so, basically the three arguments, as I understand them, is that Putin is, we focus on Putin all the time, to the detriment of our understanding of Russia. Putin is not one man who is controlling everything that happens in Russia. He's part of a system, and the title of the book comes out of a kind of appeal for us to think about Russia without Putin as a place where a lot of things happen outside of control, and Russia cannot be reduced to Putin. The other argument is about Yeltsin in the 90s. In which you say that far from being discontinuous, as it's usually described, the Putin regime has been far more continuous with the Yeltsin regime than we understand or think, and it's important to explain why. And then the third argument is about the Soviet inheritance. Once again, you kind of flip the conventional wisdom on its head. And going back to the 90s, people outside of Russia and inside of Russia were always saying, well, once we rid ourselves of the Soviet inheritance, then we will have a wonderful, flourishing country. In fact, you argue that much of the, many of the kind of apparent achievements of Russia in the Putin years have been underwritten by the Soviet inheritance, with, of course, oil and gas being a kind of major factor there. So I guess the thing that I would start with actually is Putin, annoyingly. Can you talk about your understanding of how the system is not fixated and around Putin when it seems, and we now have, kind of apparent confirmation of this with Putin's apparent decision to stay on indefinitely, given that the system seems to understand itself as being centered around Putin, why should we understand it differently?
That's an excellent question. And thank you for that very good condensed summary of the arguments of the book. That was way better than I've managed in the introduction to the book itself. So I think, first of all, I guess I should concede that it is a very centralized system. It is a very personalistic system as well. So the power of Putin as an individual, as well as his institutional power as the president, those are two slightly different things. We can talk about that. But both of those things are very present in the system and carry a lot of weight. So I guess I'm not trying to argue that Putin is not important at all. But what I want to argue is that even that very strong personal power he possesses is a feature of this system, right? I think that there is a tendency to describe Putin's personal power as if it's sort of floating freely of the rest of the political system and the rest of the society, and as if, in fact, he is some sort of modern day, autocrat who can simply just wave his whatever they hold in their hand and lo, something happens. And I think what my emphasis on the system is trying to do is understand what kind of figure is this person, and why does he have that exorbitant power? And the answer is because it serves a set of purposes, right? So the way I tend to see Putin is that he does have this exorbitant power, but that's because he fills a role very well for that system, that he's an excellent arbiter of different interest groups. He is a good kind of figurehead of authority. And yes, over time, because he is that important kind of personification of power in Russia, it has become more entrenched, this sort of personalism attached to power. But nevertheless, I do think it is a system that we need to look at. The other way you could think about this, I think, is that many years ago, people in the West tended to understand the Soviet Union through this kind of paradigm of totalitarianism, that there is this sort of total power of the state and it's run by Stalin as a dictator, and that's all there is to be understood about the Soviet Union. And obviously decades later, and lots of scholarship was done, and it turned out that was actually fundamentally wrong, that Soviet society was actually very complex. And even though it had this one exorbitantly powerful man at the top, there was actually a lot going on underneath that needed to be understood, and otherwise you didn't really understand the Soviet Union. So part of what I'm trying to do is, in a way, save us a lot of time, because that kind of the totalitarian theory is obviously still very much alive and with us, but it took good decades of scholarship to really undo it. And I think no one who seriously studies Soviet history thinks that anymore. And so what I want to do is a contemporary version of that and say, look, yes, Putin is important, but there is so much more to understand about Russia that besides him, that even if you concede his importance, that still doesn't get you that far, I guess.
Great, and so I think we should come back to that, but I want to kind of move into the next question, which is the continuity with Yeltsin. So something that I've come to believe, and yet I'm not great at articulating it, is, well, the system a lot of the reforms, right, that Yeltsin began have been continued, right, under what we call the neoliberal reforms. At the same time, there is there are things like price controls, right? There are continue to be state subsidies for these kind of mono towns, right? That are considered important because if you let the factory go under, then you have 30,000 people or 50,000 people without any livelihood or anything to do. So, it's not quite the total kind of neoliberal wild capitalism of the 90s, right?
Mm.
So can you just kind of talk us through how we should understand, the Putin system, in the context of whether it's capitalist or what?
Sure. Yeah, I guess the way I would describe the relationship between the Yeltsin and the Putin years is as two different phases in the life of the same system, right? So that they're not by any means identical. There are a lot of contrast between these two phases. But on the other hand, it is still one system that is growing and evolving and consolidating. And I think a lot of the differences that you're describing there between the two periods are to do with a change of emphasis, a change of strategy in some areas, and if you like, a recalibration, right? That Yeltsin is really, what he does is oversee the destruction of the old system, and the emphasis is very much on pushing through market reforms as quickly as possible, rapid transfers of property, rapid creation of inequality, and the priority really is there on destruction, if you like. And Putin, his whole emphasis is very different. It's on consolidation of the state, rebuilding of the authority of the state, its capacity to do things like pay pensions. That was important. And in terms of its economic strategy, there is a bit of a tilt where the privatizing sort of neoliberal impulse continues under Putin in various sectors of the economy. There's like a new labor code, makes it easier to fire workers. For example, in the early 2000s, there's also a flat tax. Income tax in Russia is a flat 13%, whatever bracket of income you're in. That was introduced in 2001. That's a very regressive right-wing measure. So in some areas, that is what Putin is doing, continuing with that privatizing momentum. But in certain key areas, he is overseeing a return of state control, and that you see that especially in the realm of oil and gas. Now, most of the Western financial press and media sees that as a sort of creeping takeover of the state, a return to state capitalism or something like that. And I think that's an overreaction, because in most of the world, actually everywhere in the world apart from the US, state ownership of oil companies is the norm. Any country with that quantity of natural resources is usually a state-owned company that oversees that, because that's how those states run their budgets and that's how they're able to afford to do what they do. It's only the US that actually doesn't do that. So what you see in the 2000s is Russia actually thinks, hang on, we need to return to the norm and actually have state control over these strategic resources, and we can then guide the ship of state much more stably through whatever's to come. And I think that is really the contrast. There's a term I borrowed from a political scientist called Gerald Easter. He calls it an upstairs-downstairs economy that Russia has. The upstairs meaning large-scale strategic assets like oil companies, and downstairs is everything else, retail, manufacturing, whatever, where the upstairs that's run by the state, no questions there. And the downstairs, private business, the market can have free reign. And so I think you need to see these, if you like, two different spheres, and that's what the Putin regime does. But behind that, I think you have to see that there's a real continuity in terms of the Yeltsin and Putin government's commitment to the principle of private profit. That remains unchanged throughout, and there are two ways you can immediately gauge that. One is the quantity of billionaires, which in the 90s was only a handful, and under Putin just goes through the roof. I think even now, well, maybe not now because of the massive recession, but an earlier this year they had something like 90 odd billionaires, which is a substantial number. The other way you can see that is inequalities of wealth and income, where the graph of that, if you like, sees a spike in the 1990s when Yeltsin is in charge, sudden creation of inequality, and then a kind of steady growth under Putin, less dramatic, but still steadily increasing. And if you like, that is the kind of picture I'd want to present the two governments, or 2 decades, or I guess it's several decades now, the 90s and then since the 2000s, that there's a sudden lurch into capitalism under Yeltsin, and then a period of consolidation, but nonetheless continuation of that same line under Putin.
So in the same vein, I'm going to use two terms. I'm going to name two terms that you do not like, and I want you to explain why you don't like them. So terms that we hear a lot with regard to Russia: kleptocracy and mafia state. Mm-hmm. Why don't you like those terms?
Yeah, these do get thrown around a lot. I mean, it's certainly, there's plenty of corruption at the top of the Russian state. So I'm not, my dislike of the term doesn't have anything to do with wanting to defend the reputations of anybody in government. It's more that I think, well, taking kleptocracy, I think a lot of the writing that tends to use that term, the focus is on a small coterie of people who've somehow appropriated the state apparatus and are, stealing a bunch of money. And then the logical implication behind that, it seems to me, is a sort of financial version of the regime change philosophy, which is that if only you could get rid of this band of kleptocrats, then everything would be fine. So you identify who the kleptocrats are in the US sanctions lists, and then, you put pressure on their bank accounts, and then they will behave, and then everything will be back to normal. And I think mafia state, the implications are somewhat similar. These are sort of a criminal set of individuals who have seized control of the state, and they need to stop being so bad. The problem with that is I think that really the individuals who are being targeted by that vocabulary, they're really the tip of the iceberg. And I think that what they do and how they appropriate wealth is not a phenomenon confined to 20 or 30 or even 40 or 50 people. It's really actually systemic. And I think a lot of these things, I guess the underlying point that we're getting at here is, what kind of capitalism does Russia have? Right? Does it have a capitalism that is somehow impeded from functioning properly by these individuals? Which is what I think the kleptocracy interpretation suggests, that actually, if you got rid of these people, then Russia would have a perfectly good capitalism that we would like. And that's not my view at all. I guess that's the source of my discomfort with the term, which is that this is the kind of capitalism Russia has, and the kleptocracy and mafia state features of it are somehow integral to that system, to that socioeconomic order. And so you could get rid of the kleptocrats and you would have another 20 take their place, because that is how the whole economy works. So I think in a way it's the economic parallel to my argument about the obsessive focus on Putin and the political system, which is that you need to think more broadly about the whole economic system, not just these 20, 30 individuals.
Why does Russia have this kind of capitalism?
I think a lot of it has to do with the moment of creation, if you like, in the late 80s, early 90s, the form in which the transition to capitalism was carried out. I mean, one of the really important features of it, and I think that feeds through into everything we're seeing today, is that so Yeltsin was elected president of Russia, the Russian part of the Soviet Union, before the fall of the USSR. And he was elected on a program of reform, and it wasn't totally clear what that reform would involve. People were thinking at that point, I'm sure there was a broad majority for some kind of transition to a more market-based order, but it was not really clear what that would involve. And then when the transition happened, obviously this is a full-blown economic crisis that the country is going through as it's falling apart. But there is no point in the early 1990s where there is a democratic mandate for this particular program of capitalist transformation, right? And I think that feature is really important in two ways. One is that there is no democratic legitimacy for what is happening to everyone's lives, that it has a very powerful disenfranchising, disempowering effect on the population at large. But also it means that the kind of economic transformation you're overseeing is really kind of an elite pact. It's carried out by unaccountable people from the top down, often with very powerful input from outsiders. I mean, it's known that US economic advisors wrote a lot of the decrees that Yeltsin then just signed for privatizing things. And so I think the whole shape of capitalism in Russia is really determined, if you like, by that moment of a very kind of anti-democratic top-down elite process. So if you were to say in 1991, let's do capitalism, let's make it top-down, totally non-transparent, totally crooked, totally unaccountable to any of the population, and then say, what's that going to look like in 30 years' time? Yeah, the answer would be kleptocracy, but it's not because, you know, 5 people started stealing stuff and putting it in Swiss bank accounts 5 years ago. It's because of how you set it up in the first place.
So is that something that, I mean, you know, and what you're describing as the kleptocracy argument is not just a Western, you know, model. It's also very much Navalny's position. It has been for a long time. Is it something that can be, can Russia get back onto the track of a more humane or capitalism, or does it need a revolution, a socialist revolution?
I mean, that's obviously my inclination. I guess I would say I think it needs, if not a revolution, then certainly a very profound rethinking of what power is for and what the economy is for, who it serves. Because the current basis for that economy is a very strong market-based order that serves the principle of private profit, and that works very well for some people, mostly not very well for everyone else. And I think obviously this is a generic problem of human societies in the present moment. And it's interesting that you mentioned Navalny. I'm sure people might be aware of him. He's a kind of leading opposition figure in Russia. He's been the target of a lot of kind of Kremlin dirty tricks of various kinds. He was supposed to be running for president and then was legally barred from doing so. He's been, you know, tried on various cooked up corruption charges, etc. Just a bit of backdrop. He has also some problematic features in his politics and background, some kind of, I think, frankly, very ugly nationalist strands to his politics. He's a very problematic figure. What's interesting about him is when he ran for president in 2018, or rather he put the platform together in 2017, barred from running, that platform actually takes back a lot of his more neoliberal politics. And so in 2017-18, Navalny undertook something of a turn to the left. And for example, he was talking a lot more about social welfare. His language was much more left-wing, and certainly there was a much stronger emphasis on social provision and welfare than he previously had in anything I've ever read that he said. Now, I don't know how sincere transformation that is ideologically, but in some ways it's more interesting if it's not, right? Because he feels he has to tack to the left, probably, I think, because that's where the country's political center of gravity is. So I think there is some understanding in Russia that what power should be used for is to provide for the people who live here, right? In a very basic way. And I think the system that they have doesn't do that. So in some ways, I guess I'm saying it might not need a revolution. It might just need a rethinking in a more profound way of what we're doing on a daily basis. But that's a big ask, I know. And, you know, not that we're anywhere near that here either.
I'm looking at some of the questions in chat. I'm going to throw some of the questions from the chat into our discussion. A question from Laura Mills. What social movements are active now in Russia?
Mm. Ooh, great.
Let's do that one.
Yeah, so this is one of the interesting things about Russia, is that there has been on a mostly a fairly small scale and very dispersed geographically, but from the mid 2000s onwards, a kind of bubbling up of social movements of very different kinds. So there are ecological movements, there are movements to organize for kind of around housing. There's a lot of very interestingly, a lot of new trade union movements. One of the odd features, I go into this a bit in the book, is that some of the most militant and active trade unions in Russia were set up in factories established by Western companies. So, for example, Volkswagen, Renault, a lot of them in car manufacturing. And so there's been a wave of that kind of union militancy here and there. Also, social movements cropping up in kind of unexpected places. There was a movement of long-range truck drivers, for example. They were opposing a toll system, and this was actually a very powerful, by Russian standards again, movement, and surprising where it came from. So there is a kind of bubbling up of very different, ideologically hugely varied social movements. And the question is always, how do you knit them together, and what would a program of action for those people look like? And I think, people have been trying for a long time to do that, and it's very, very difficult. So, and also I should say that they face very, very strong pressure from the state, a lot of direct repression, physical violence. So it's a very hostile environment for a lot of these people. But there are things happening. And this actually gets back to the question of the Soviet legacies that Keith was mentioning earlier. One of the things I want to argue in this book is that the idea that when the Soviet legacies run out, we will have a normal society where everyone is happy and capitalism is working well. I think that's exactly wrong. And in a way, the fact that these social movements are bubbling up, they're bubbling up in response to capitalism. And because these are movements now made up of people who know nothing else, a lot of them. And that in a way is a sign that, if anything, the waning of those Soviet legacies will mean less stability rather than more.
Kind of a broader version of the same question. When we read media accounts of Russia, it often sounds like there can be no politics outside of Putinist politics, right? And that the repression is so bad and so violent that it's hard to imagine how a social movement could form. And it has gotten worse, since 2014. And kind of worse and worse, right? So can you just talk more generally about what space exists for social movements in politics, and then where they kind of get cut off?
Yeah, so actually, I mean, just a good kind of case study of this, if you like, is the movements that emerged when the Russian government announced an increase in the pension age. This was in the summer of 2018. They were going to increase the pension age from 60 for men to 65, and from 55 to 63 for women, I think. And there's a very large outburst of protests, even in the middle of the World Cup, which was happening at that point in Russia. And I was actually in Russia at the time, and I went to a bunch of these different protests, and that showed me a couple of things. One is there was a very broad wave of public support for the protests. These were very popular. The government reform was very unpopular. Like 90% of the population surveyed said this is a terrible idea and very bad. I mean, just so people maybe might not be aware, but raising the pension age to 65 in Russia for men is actually higher than life expectancy in a lot of the country. So, but those protests themselves were dispersed. Even in a big city like Moscow, they were organized by different political parties and movements, often for the same day in different parts of town. And they were very tightly policed. And so you could see that there was a simultaneous kind of emergence from below of a lot of energy and opposition, but at the same time, a kind of dispersal of those energies through different political movements. The question as always, is how deliberate was that? Like, were these parties actually spoiling the movement from below, or were they just genuinely inept? Or option three, were they really just not ready to channel this and actually challenge the government full on? And I'm not quite sure which of those things applies, probably some mixture depending on the movement, but it did show me that it's not just that there isn't much space for opposition in Russia because of the police presence or the repression, but actually also the existing structure of political parties and unions, the way the political field is organized, if you like, makes it quite hard to form a common agenda. And that in itself is a major obstacle. But weighing somewhat against that is that a lot of the Russian political system, these are political parties which don't have much oppositional weight. They're often kind of empty shells, if you like. But there is a tendency in Russian and Soviet history for empty shells of that kind to suddenly be filled with content at moments of crisis. And so I wouldn't be totally surprised if some of these pseudo-oppositional parties suddenly find themselves overtaken by oppositional energy at different moments. So there are structures which could be infused by that kind of energy, but just it's not been happening yet.
Thank you. Another question from our chat from Diego Couchet. He asks, how does the vision of the state and nationalism tie into the rhetoric that accompanies the economic system and its ability to endure? So,
yeah, so that's an interesting, I guess I would say the nationalist emphasis and ideology is relatively recent. By that I mean it's really become much stronger since 2012, since Putin's return to the presidency in 2012. I think for most of the 2000s, I mean, maybe this is a mistaken impression, but so Keith can correct me, but I feel like the Putin compact with the population, if you like, was based on the idea that generally incomes are rising, we're providing prosperity, and this is a perfectly acceptable trade-off. You know, you get to vote for 4 parties instead of 10, and you don't like any of them anyway. What's the problem? But essentially, it was a kind of rising tide of prosperity that underwrote the popularity of the regime. And broadly speaking, the contrast with the 90s was also an important factor in stabilizing it. That people had been so miserable before, and now things were improving. That it was really a positive investment in the stability of the Putin system. By 2012, I think the picture is very different. You've had the global economic crisis, the fallout of that. You've had more clashes with the West. And so the regime starts to deploy this much more nationalistic rhetoric. The prosecution of Pussy Riot and the kind of culture war type thing unleashed there is an important signal, if you like, of that shift. So I think, if you like, these are different kind of emphases the same regime has adopted. And the problem really is that nationalist overtone brings with it various kind of contradictions that the regime has to address. And one is that the more you mobilize this kind of ethnic Russian component, the more problems that creates in managing what is a hugely varied multi-ethnic state. And so Putin has had to, and the government have had to kind of somehow manage both an appeal to sort of Russian tradition with a kind of, but of course we are a plural multi-ethnic state. And so I guess I would say each of the strategies they've adopted has brought its own problems. And I think since 2012, the whole economic fate of the country has been much more turbulent and up and down. So it's been a slightly more troubled phase. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Just kind of a question that returns us a little bit to the question of the state's relationship to its oligarchs from Story Punver. What do you think of Putin's relationship with the country's oligarchs or kleptocrats compared with the precedent set by Yeltsin?
Yeah, so there's a sort of famous meeting in the year 2000. Putin is newly president. And he's meeting with, I think, something like 20 of the top oligarchs at the time, and he lays out new rules, essentially saying, you know, I think the term he uses is you have to remain equidistant from the state. And the broad outline of the new kind of deal that he lays out is, you guys go on and make profits, that's fine, we'll leave you alone. The minute you try and meddle in politics and the running of the state, we will come after you. And immediately, obviously, he gets rid of a few of the major oligarchs of the 90s. Boris Berezovsky is one. He's goes into exile in the UK. Vladimir Gusinski is another. There's a sort of spread of these people. At the time, that was seen as like Putin unleashing a war on the oligarchs. And I think, again, if you look at the numbers of billionaires in Russia, is anything but. He's really actually helped create a much expanded class of mega rich people in Russia. The difference is that he changed the rules by which you're allowed to profit, right? What is acceptable conduct and what is not. I think the question of the relationship to the state that was in the question is really important. That is central. That in a way, in the 90s, the relationship between the oligarchs and the state was too close. And so what Putin was trying to do was rebalance that and create a bit more space so that the state is independent of these oligarchs. They're not actually directly managing politics. But even so, a lot of the most wealthy people in Russia are state officials. And I think, one way of thinking about this, maybe in a broader comparative context, is that in large and wealthy countries like the US, generally speaking, the wealthiest people in the country are not necessarily the people running the state, right? I mean, there's a huge overlap in that. I mean, I think how many senators are not billionaires? Probably like Bernie Sanders and like maybe two others, I don't know. But generally speaking, there's a very large, complicated, elite class of billionaires, and then there are the people who run the state. And in Russia, those two categories of people just overlap a lot more. Partly because they profit from proximity to the state, but partly just because it's a personnel question that there aren't that many of them. And I think in that sense, Russia is not unlike a lot of other middle-income countries. I mean, Latin America is obviously a region I'm very familiar with, that political power and economic power are just much more tightly interwoven. And that's mostly a very bad thing. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying it's not uncommon, and Russia is not that unusual in that respect.
Yeah, I was as you were talking, I was thinking about the kind of famous, infamous. I think it was in Foreign Affairs, Russia, a normal country, right? Arguing that basically Russia has this is from like 2004, but a few years into Putin, right? Arguing that Russia basically has the kind of political system that you would expect from a country at its level of income and development. What are the, what is specific to Russia in that context?
Well, I think in terms of geopolitically, it has a very different weight. So yeah, this article obviously put it in the kind of normal country, middle ranking kind of area. Like I think the comparison used a lot was Indonesia, maybe, I think, something like that. And the difference is, this is a country which has a very large percentage of the world's nuclear weapons. It has, the remnants of a hugely advanced scientific technical apparatus. It has a very large military apparatus, of course. It's one of the world's largest arms manufacturers and sellers. I think second maybe after the US. And that Soviet legacy, if you like, is still very, very present. And it does weigh on the present in a number of important ways. I think the kinds of decisions that Russia makes on the world stage are very different from the kind of decisions any other state of its income level would make. I mean, if you compare it with something like Brazil, it's really not. Obviously we hear a lot about Brazil in the news in general, but in terms of whose opinions have to be taken account of in the Middle East, Brazil is not an actor. Russia is. It's a lot nearer, but it's not that near. So I think there is a sense in which the habits of the former superpower remain, but Russia's capacity to actually wield that power successfully are decreasing. And I think a lot of the tensions we see on the world stage, I mean, this is obviously a very large topic, but there is something very kind of crucial to that mismatch between the expectations of power and the realities of what you can do with it, that I think set Russia apart in the moment.
so yeah, following up on that a little bit, your last chapter talks about Russia on the world stage, right? And this kind of argument about, the thing we hear all the time now about, Russia's grand strategy is to destroy the Western democracies, to destroy NATO. I mean, there's something to that, right? I mean, Russia wouldn't mind if NATO collapsed, certainly, right? Yeah, can you just talk a bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, as you put it, yeah, I think they wouldn't be crying if NATO disappeared, certainly. But one of the things I think that is really important to bear in mind is just to have a sense of the proportions of who has power in this overall situation. Like if you compare military spending, I mean, the US obviously dwarfs the next, I don't know, I think 8, 9 countries. And if you combine the US and NATO spending, Russia is like a tiny proportion of that. So in terms of who is able to wield power on the world stage, Russia is really not a major player in that regard. And the idea that Russia has some kind of deeply thought through plan to destroy Western democracy is actually really ludicrous. This is like saying, I mean, for comparison in terms of per capita GDP, this is like saying Portugal is out to destroy US democracy. I mean, they're not, but also good luck with that. I mean, you're really not going to be able to do much. And so the question is really, why do people think that's the case? And I think the answer is that it gets back to that point I was making about having the instincts of a great power, but lacking the means to do it, that what Russia is able to do successfully is kind of poke at things and to act as a spoiler, if you like. But in terms of being able to affect a situation without weighing in with military force, for example, that's actually quite a good measure of power. The Russia is not able to do that. I think one of the sort of maybe perverse interpretations I have, but I think I'm right, is that a lot of what is framed as Russian aggression, these are indeed aggressive acts. I'm not denying that they're aggressive acts. For example, the annexation of Crimea, the intervention in eastern Ukraine, these are undoubtedly aggressive actions, but the aggression itself is a measure of how much less power Russia has. If Russia was able to truly wield power, like the EU, for example, the EU can dangle an association agreement with Ukraine and get what it wants. The US can just say, don't do that, and the Ukrainians won't do it for the most part. Whereas Russia really can't do that without physically sending troops in to mess the situation up. And I think that it doesn't make the aggression any less lethal. And certainly for the people of Eastern Ukraine, it doesn't make any difference. What I'm saying, this is, it's very bad news. But in terms of understanding the larger picture, I think one has to bear in mind that the aggression is a measure of weakness rather than strength. And I think once you see it that way around, then you have to rethink a lot of the assumptions about how we're covering Russia and its, supposed plan to destroy Western democracy.
Thank you. So this is I'm gonna use the prerogative of the moderator to ask a personal something I'm very deeply interested in. But to also connect this to our current moment with Trump, right? So Putin and Trump are very dissimilar in many ways. They have some similarities. The reaction to them from their opposition, right, in the US and Russia has been remarkably similar, right? And one of the kind of tropes of that reaction is this argument about authoritarianism. And so I just want to know what you think of it, both in the Russian case, whether that's a useful framing, right? I mean, even the Bernie Sanders campaign, right, when they talked about Russia, they tended to talk about Russia as a kind of corrupt authoritarian state that was, part of a kind of axis of other corrupt authoritarian states, not necessarily left or right leaning, right? and versus the Western democracies, right? So when people talk about authoritarianism in Russia, when they talk about it in the U.S., what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think the term gets you so far, but not much further, is what I would say. That undoubtedly there is a pattern of behavior in the case of Putin and a lot of other figures of sort of very strong assertions of power and willingness to remain there indefinitely and so on. The thing that I think is important to bear in mind about Putin is that he is, and sounds perverse, but he's actually scrupulously legalistic. That is why, for example, he left the presidency for 4 years and then came back, rather than change the constitution to just stay indefinitely. And even these new constitutional changes he's proposing, it's all been quite carefully choreographed to make sure the initiative is coming from somewhere else and it's voted through, and it's all just very technically done so that it's precisely not an autocrat saying, here is how things are going to be, I'm just going to do it and you have to take it. And I think what's interesting about that is that the substance is certainly that of an authoritarian, I don't doubt it, but in terms of the means of how it's done, it has this facade of legalism and democratic process even, that is actually very important to Putin, perversely. And I think that is where it's interesting, because in a way, the authoritarian term doesn't really tell you much about how these regimes secure whatever degree of consent they need for what they're doing. And to me, that's the interesting part. Like, there's a sense in which Putin is going to be very different from Trump in that regard. He has different tools, he uses different means. He's scrupulously legalistic, whereas Trump, doesn't read anything. And dissimilar again from figures like Orban or, who else, or Modi or people like that. And I think in a way, maybe once you've put all these people in that category, it then becomes more important to differentiate them, is what I would say.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I will also point everyone to the link to Tony's book to buy it in the chat. Buy it from McNally. I mean, we're all here at McNally. Might as well buy your copy here. So I'm actually gonna crudely combine all the other questions in the chat into one big question, and that is, what do you think is going to happen going forward in Russia?
Well, that's a good question. So I'm going to preface this by saying a lot of the coverage of Russia before the coronavirus centered around these constitutional changes that Putin is trying to push through, and the idea that he is doing this in order to remain in power indefinitely. I'm not actually sure that's what they're for. I think he could remain in power indefinitely, but actually what I really think they're for is to multiply his options. Basically, before now, the idea is Putin is in power till 2024, he has to hand over to someone else, and this imposes a deadline. He has to find a successor, he has to balance all the factions and find someone who is not going to be a disaster and who is going to give him immunity from prosecution, that kind of consideration. And it sets a very hard deadline because, again, he is very legalistic. This needs to happen. And so what he has done is create a kind of cloud of ambiguity about his intentions, about the future, about any kind of succession. It's really not clear. Is he going to stay forever? That's one option, yes. Is he going to nominate a successor, which he can now do at any point in the next God knows how long? Is he going to nominate a successor who is less powerful, migrate into a different role himself? I just think this is one of the things that makes it very hard to predict, because what he has done, I think, is not create a kind of permanent Putin presidency necessarily. He's actually just multiplied the options. So I think in a way, we know what's going to happen until 2024. He'll stay there. The question becomes, what happens between now and then? And there's a lot of very rough water to navigate, obviously economically, especially, with oil prices being where they are, and Russia's very dependent on that I wouldn't rule out Putin staying beyond 2024, but then actually finding a successor relatively quickly after that. That this system really lifts the pressure off him to settle that question, but it also does give him the option of not staying forever if he wants. And I think we have to bear in mind, and this is in a way what I try and do in the updated epilogue to the book, which is to try and take account of that possibility that actually he could leave, at which point we will need to really understand what is this system which now, at some point, unspecified point between now and 2030, say, is going to have a hole at its center. And then I think the character of the system becomes more important than the man again.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Tony. Thanks for having us, McNally. Thank you for all the questions, everybody, in the chat. They were great.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. And be well. Be safe, everybody. We do have the book at McNallyJackson.com. You can also see who else we're bringing to your home. But thank you, Keith. Thank you, Tony.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, as it were.